In the quiet village of Ikot-obong, there lived a man named Ubong. Life had not been kind to him. His days were filled with hunger, hard labor, and worry. His small hut, built from mud and thatched palm leaves, stood on a piece of barren land at the edge of the village. Despite his best efforts, the land refused to yield a good harvest, and his farm remained dry and bare. He had no family to support him, no friends to rely on. Every day was a struggle just to survive. One afternoon, while resting under the shade of an old palm tree that grew on the outskirts of his land, Ubong began to lament his fate. "Why have the gods abandoned me?" he murmured, his voice hoarse with despair. "Why must I work so hard, yet have nothing to show for it?" The wind whispered softly through the fronds of the palm tree, as if answering his question. Ubong, lost in thought, did not notice at first. But then, he felt a strange sensation, like a presence beside him. He sat up, startled, and saw that the palm tree, the very one that had always been there, seemed different. It glistened, almost glowing in the fading light of the sun. Its bark shimmered, and the leaves rustled in a way that sounded almost like words. "Ubong," a voice said, soft but firm. It was not from any person he could see, but it seemed to come from the palm tree itself. Ubong leaped to his feet, his heart pounding. Who speaks?" he asked, his voice shaking. "It is I," the tree responded, its voice calm and soothing. "I have watched you struggle for many years, and I know the pain you carry. But do not despair, for your fortune is about to change." Ubong stared at the tree in disbelief. "A tree? Speaking to me? How is this possible?" The palm tree's leaves swayed gently. "In this world, many things are possible that you do not understand. Listen carefully, Ubong. I will guide you to wealth and prosperity, but you must follow my instructions exactly." Desperate for a change in his fortune, Ubong nodded eagerly. "Tell me what I must do." "Every morning, you will come to me," the tree began, "and from my branches, you will gather 10 palm nuts. Only 10. Take these to the market and sell them. Do this every day, and soon you will see your life transform." Ubong was puzzled. 10 palm nuts? He had seen the nuts on the tree before and never thought much of them. They were hardly worth anything in the market, barely enough to buy a handful of food. But the tree's voice held a power that he could not deny, so he agreed. The next morning, Ubong rose early and went to the tree. As instructed, he gathered exactly 10 palm nuts and took them to the market. To his surprise, a merchant approached him immediately and offered a price far higher than Ubong had ever expected. The same happened the next day and the next. Day after day, Ubong returned to the tree, gathering his 10 nuts and selling them at the market. Each time, the price seemed to rise. Before long, Ubong was no longer struggling to survive. He bought new clothes, rebuilt his home, and even acquired a small plot of fertile land. People in the village began to notice his sudden change in fortune and whispered among themselves, wondering how a man who had been so poor could suddenly afford so much. But Ubong kept the secret of the palm tree to himself. One evening, after several weeks of prosperity, Ubong returned to the tree, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you, wise tree," he said. "Because of you, I now live comfortably. But tell me, why did you choose to help me?" The palm tree's voice was soft, almost like the wind itself. "Your heart was pure, Ubong. Many passed me by, but none saw me as you did. You sat beneath my shade not for greed, but for rest, and in your pain, you sought only a simple life. For this, I have chosen to bless you. But remember, wealth can be both a gift and a curse." Ubong nodded thoughtfully. The tree's words stayed with him, reminding him to remain humble despite his newfound success. However, as time passed, Ubong's curiosity grew. What if he gathered more than 10 nuts? What if he could sell 20? Or 50? Wouldn't that make him even richer? The temptation tugged at him, though the tree's warning echoed in his mind. And so, one day, Ubong made a decision that would change everything. Ubong couldn't shake the thought of gathering more than 10 palm nuts. Every day, As he collected the precise number from the tree, his mind would wander to how much richer he could be if he just took a little more. The wealth he had gained so far was enough to live comfortably, but he started to dream of something bigger. Luxury beyond his village, perhaps a grand house in the city, servants, and endless gold. One morning, driven by this desire, Ubong approached the palm tree, feeling the weight of his greed. He stood beneath its towering branches, hesitating for a moment as he remembered the tree's warning. But in the end, his ambition won. Just this once, Ubong whispered to himself. Surely, the tree won't notice if I take a few more. Carefully, he plucked 20 palm nuts from the tree, double the usual amount. His hands trembled as he placed them in his basket. He glanced up at the tree, half expecting it to speak or show some sign of disapproval, but it remained silent, its leaves rustling softly in the morning breeze. Feeling a surge of confidence, Ubong headed to the market. As expected, the merchants were eager to buy his palm nuts, and with the extra nuts, he made twice as much money. That evening, he returned home, his pockets heavy with coins. This is just the beginning, he thought, his mind racing with new possibilities. Tomorrow I'll take 30. The next day, Ubong did just that, this time gathering 30 nuts. Once again, the tree said nothing, and once again, Ubong sold them for a handsome profit. Over the following days, he continued to increase the number of palm nuts he harvested, 40, 50, 60. With each visit to the market, Ubong's wealth grew. His small home was soon replaced by a grander house, adorned with fine furniture and golden decorations. He hired workers to tend his new lands, bought the finest clothing, and dined on exotic foods that had never been seen in his village. But with every extra nut he took from the tree, something strange began to happen. The palm tree, once strong and vibrant, started to wither. Its leaves, which had been a deep, healthy green, turned yellow and brittle. The bark, once smooth and gleaming, became dry and cracked. Yet Ubong, blinded by his greed, didn't notice. He was too consumed by his growing wealth to care. One evening, after a particularly successful day at the market, Ubong returned to the tree with a sense of triumph. He had gathered 100 palm nuts that day, and the merchants had practically thrown money at him. But as he approached the tree, he froze in shock. The palm tree, the very source of his fortune, stood bare. Its once lush crown of leaves had completely fallen, and its trunk was twisted and blackened as if struck by a terrible disease. The air around it felt cold and heavy, and for the first time, Ubong felt a deep sense of dread. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice trembling. As if in answer, the tree spoke, though its voice was faint and strained. "Ubong, you have taken more than was meant for you. You were warned, yet you let your greed consume you." Ubong fell to his knees before the dying tree, tears filling his eyes. "I'm sorry," he cried. "I didn't mean to harm you. Please, tell me what to do to make things right." The tree's voice was barely audible now, like a whisper in the wind. "You have broken the balance, Ubong. Wealth taken in excess brings ruin, not only to you, but to the land itself. There is a price for greed, and now it must be paid." Before Ubong could respond, a powerful gust of wind swept through the clearing. The ground beneath him trembled, and the sky darkened as clouds gathered overhead. The palm tree let out a deep, creaking sound, as if it were in pain, and then, with a final groan, it collapsed to the ground in a shower of dust and dead leaves. Ubong stared in horror at the fallen tree, realizing too late the gravity of his actions. The wealth he had accumulated now felt like a curse, a heavy burden that weighed on his soul. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Ubong knew that his life would never be the same again. The tree was gone, and with it, the mysterious blessing that had once lifted him from poverty. Now, he was left with a gnawing fear. What would happen next? Would the village discover his secret? Would the land, once fertile under the tree's influence, now turn barren and lifeless? But even as the rain poured down, Ubong felt a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to make amends, a way to restore the balance he had shattered. But the journey to redemption would not be easy, and the challenges that awaited him were far greater than he could imagine. In the days that followed the collapse of the palm tree, a heavy shadow hung over Ubong. His once grand house now felt cold and empty, despite the wealth he had amassed. He could no longer enjoy his riches. Every gold coin, every piece of fine furniture reminded him of the tree he had destroyed. The tree's warning echoed in his mind, and he knew that the balance had been broken. Soon, the effects of his actions began to spread throughout the village. The land, once fertile, started to dry up. Crops withered, wells ran dry, and the lush greenery that surrounded the village turned brown and lifeless. People whispered of a curse, though they did not know its source. But Ubong knew. Guilt weighed on him like a heavy stone. One evening, as he sat alone in his grand home, unable to sleep, he heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, he found an old woman standing on his doorstep. She was a stranger to the village, her skin wrinkled with age, her hair silver as moonlight, but her eyes shone with a wisdom that unnerved him. "I know what you've done, Ubong," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange, otherworldly quality. Ubong's heart sank. He stepped aside, allowing her in, though his hands trembled. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The spirits of the land speak to me," the woman replied as she sat down at the table. The palm tree was no ordinary tree. It was a guardian, a spirit that protected this land and its people. By feeding you its bounty, it hoped you would share your fortune with the village, to bring prosperity to all. But your greed has brought ruin instead. Tears filled Ubong's eyes. "I didn't know," he said, his voice choked with regret. I thought I could have more, that it was meant for me alone. What can I do to fix this?" The old woman studied him carefully. "There may still be a way to restore the balance, but it will not be easy. The palm tree's spirit is not gone. It has only retreated into the earth, wounded and weak. You must seek it out, deep in the heart of the forest, where the oldest trees grow. There, you will find a way to atone for your greed, but the path will be dangerous, and the price you must pay will be great." Ubong nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "I'll do whatever it takes. I can't live with the destruction I've caused." The woman stood, her eyes still fixed on him. "Then leave at dawn. Take nothing with you but your courage. The forest will test you, and you must be willing to sacrifice whatever the spirits demand." As soon as the sun began to rise the next morning, Ubong set out on his journey. He left behind his house, his wealth, and everything he had gained. The villagers watched him go, confused by his sudden departure, but too preoccupied with their own troubles to ask questions. The forest loomed ahead, dark and ancient. The further Ubong walked, the thicker the trees became, their twisted roots and branches creating a maze that seemed to close in on him. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the village faded until all he could hear was the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant cry of an animal. For days, he wandered deeper into the forest, surviving on the few fruits and herbs he could find. As the old woman had warned, the forest seemed alive with strange forces, testing his resolve. At night, he was haunted by dreams of the palm tree, now twisted and blackened, reaching out to him with brittle branches. In the dreams, he could hear its voice, faint and filled with pain, urging him to continue. Finally, after what felt like weeks, Ubong reached the heart of the forest. In the clearing before him stood a circle of towering trees, their bark ancient and knotted, their roots intertwined beneath the earth. In the center of the circle was a small sapling, glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. Ubong knew at once that this was the place the old woman had spoken of. He approached the sapling cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he knelt before it, the air around him grew still, and a voice, soft and familiar, filled the clearing. "You have come, Ubong." It was the voice of the palm tree, but it sounded weaker than before, as though the spirit was barely holding on. "I am sorry," Ubong whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I have wronged you, and I have wronged the land. Tell me what I must do to make amends." The sapling's leaves trembled slightly, as if in response to his words. "You must give back what you took," the tree said. "For every palm that you took in greed, you must plant a seed. Only then can the balance be restored. But know this, ubong, each seed you plant will take a piece of your soul. The more you plant, the weaker you will become. Are you willing to pay this price?" Ubong hesitated, fear gripping his heart. The thought of losing his strength, his very essence, was terrifying. But he knew there was no other way. The village, the land, and even the palm tree's spirit depended on his sacrifice. "I will do it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. And so, Ubong began his task. The spirits of the forest guided him, giving him seeds to plant where the palm tree had once stood. With each seed he buried in the earth, he felt a piece of himself slipping away, his energy, his youth, his strength. But he did not stop. Day after day, he planted, and with each seed, the land around him began to heal. The withered trees regained their leaves, the air grew warmer, and the rivers began to flow again. By the time Ubong had planted the last seed, he was no longer the strong, healthy man he had once been. His hair had turned gray, and his hands trembled with age. But the land had been restored, and the sapling at the center of the forest had grown into a young palm tree, its leaves bright and full of life. As he knelt before the tree, exhausted but at peace, the voice of the palm tree spoke one last time. "You have restored the balance, Ubong. The land will thrive again, and your village will prosper. But your sacrifice has been great. You have given much of yourself to heal the wounds you caused, and for that, you are forgiven." Ubong smiled weakly, his body tired, but his heart light. He had paid the price, and though he had lost much, he had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that he had made things right. As he slowly made his way back to the village, Ubong knew that his days of wealth and luxury were over. But he was at peace with that. The village would thrive, the land would flourish, and the story of Ubong and the palm tree would be told for generations, a tale of greed, sacrifice, and the power of redemption. Ubong returned to the village as a changed man. His once vibrant youth had faded, leaving him frail and aged, but there was a deep peace within him that could not be mistaken. The villagers, who had watched him rise to great wealth and then disappear into the forest, were puzzled by his return. They noticed the silver in his hair, the slow way he walked, and the tiredness in his eyes. Yet, they could not deny the change that had come over the village itself. The land, which had withered under a mysterious curse, was now fertile again. The crops grew tall and green, the rivers were full and fresh, and the palm trees that dotted the village began to bear fruit in abundance. No one could explain the sudden change, but the village elders whispered of old stories, of spirits and ancient forces that could be angered and appeased only through great sacrifice. Some suspected that Ubong had something to do with the restoration, but he never spoke of what had happened in the forest. Instead, Ubong lived a simple life. He gave away what remained of his wealth, helping the poor and sharing his food with those who needed it. Though he had no family of his own, the villagers began to care for him as if he were their elder, offering him food and shelter. And in time, the village itself grew prosperous, thriving in ways it had never before. As the years passed, Ubong grew weaker, his body slowly giving way to the toll his sacrifice had taken. Yet he was never lonely, for the people of the village respected him deeply. They would visit him in his small home, asking for advice and listening to his stories about the days before the palm tree had died. One evening, as Ubong lay in his bed, he felt the end drawing near. The room was quiet, save for the distant sounds of the village preparing for the evening meal. He closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting to the palm tree that had once stood tall and proud on the edge of his land. He could still hear its voice, soft and wise, reminding him of the balance he had restored. In his final moments, Ubong felt a cool breeze sweep through his room, carrying with it the scent of the palm trees that now thrived across the village. It was as though the spirit of the tree had returned to thank him one last time. With a peaceful smile, Ubong took his last breath, knowing that he had done what was right. The village mourned his passing, but they celebrated his life. His story, the tale of a man who had once been poor and greedy but had found redemption through great sacrifice became legend. The villagers planted a palm tree in his honor, right where the old tree had once stood, and it grew tall and strong, its branches providing shade to those who came to sit beneath it. Generations later, the story of Ubong and the palm tree was still told around the village fires. It was a story not just of wealth and loss, but of humility, sacrifice, and the understanding that true wealth is found in the balance between nature and man, between giving and taking, and in the quiet peace that comes from doing what is right. And so, Ubong's legacy lived on, not in gold or riches, but in the thriving village, the fertile land, and the palm tree that stood as a reminder of the price he had paid for redemption.